I'm starting out the video with a drum that's already pretty much assembled. I glued up saves from Ziricote wood, and I've already skimmed it so it's flat. It's not the final dimension. This is actually a little thicker than it will be in the end. I'll skim off 20 thou in the end. That'll make some sense later when I'm doing the epoxy pours and carves to carve it flesh. It is a beautiful drum already, and Ziricote is $50 a board foot and up, and sometimes a lot more up. It's scary for me to now cut into this beautiful drum and do a process that I'm never 100% actually going to work. We are inside VCarve Pro. That's what I use for my design software for all my CNC projects. And this is the Anubis, I hope I'm saying that right, one of the 3 different designs I'm working with for this drum. This is an outline just of that general area. That will be used for skimming. That won't be actually part of the finished, anything you see on the drum, but I'll be using it quite a bit when I actually do the work on the CNC machine. This is the outline of the item. So on this one example, I'll be cutting that 1/10 of an inch deep, and I'll pour that one with a black color. Once it's all filled, I'll skim that back down using this one to skim the area back down to basically flush. Then I'll pour this green one, and that'll be the white coloring goes inside of the black. So 2 different pours on this. Each one of these is designed for 2 different pours. I'll talk more about that later. Now the big issue I've had with doing this, or anyone would have that, is we're going to pour into a round side, or not a level side. The biggest thing you do with pouring epoxy is to get it flat and fill in those areas. Well, later I'll show you how I did it, but I built a dam around the edges, so tall, and for the drum, that's the size of the drum, 13.875, and the biggest of my designs is 4 inches wide, so these lines are 4 inches apart. So if I pour this to fill a design, even before it starts cutting into the drum, we're basically 0.3 of an inch deep. So that's not good. You get bubbles, air bubbles, if you start pouring too deep. And all I'm really worried about is this little area below the surface where I'm pouring. So I'll cut the first outline area, fill it with epoxy, and of course it gets deep on the sides. Up here it's normal depth of a normal epoxy pour. It gets deep here. And once it's set up and cured, the next day I will skim this area back down to basically flush. I'll go a little above, but I'll skim it back down. So then when I'm trying to fill the carve the next time, I'm only worried about this little bit here. Instead of a deep cut this far, there'd be air bubbles. It wouldn't get in the very bottom very good. So that's why I'm skimming this each time. It means I'm going to use more epoxy in the end. I'm going to use a lot more epoxy. And I did so many tests before I got to actually working on the drum. There were probably 30 tests of pours getting this technique, how I was happy with it, and the designs would come out good on an uneven surface. So I've used a lot of epoxy on this, and I'm happy with the results finally. I tried different things like adding a thickener to the epoxy so I wouldn't have to worry about this dam on the side, but I lost some of the coloring. It didn't look as good, bright colors, and once you get thick, the air bubbles have nowhere to go, so you'd get air bubbles in the epoxy. For structurally, if you're doing something structurally with epoxy to hold something together, that's fine. It'll work great. But for a artsy project, the color is not good and you get bubbles. And that's just the enemy of all epoxy projects is bubbles. You don't want that. So this dam technique is the way to go, at least for this project. I've got another idea for my next project. I might try a different technique again. You know me, I like to try new things. But anyway, that's the concept. Cut the first pocket, fill it. Skim along that line, or the second pocket, and skim again, and eventually we'll skim to the surface of the drum to get the final process. Let's talk about individual ones here. I've already touched on that. I've got 3 different designs. The scarab, and each design has three different layers on this. We've got the actual design of the item, the outside edge, which this one's the outside edge, and then the inside interior stuff. So let's look at these 3. And I've kept these all different colors so it's easy to work with. I can keep them separate a little bit. So let's zoom out here. So again, the red's always the first thing I'll cut, fill, then skim out to this outside edge, fill this, and then skim again. Same colors again. Always the red is the outline, red's the outline, white's the interior color, and then the blue is always the outline of the skimming tool path. So there's 3 different arc projects, 3 different designs, each one done twice in the drum, so 6 different total pours. In a perfect world, I would pour the outline once, and of course I have to let it set up before I do the second one, because if I rotate the drum, it'll pour off the side of the drum. So pour one, wait 3-4 hours, pour the next one, wait 3-4 hours, 6 times, and then once those set up, I'd skim and do the inside. And again, pour, wait 3-4 hours, pour, wait 3-4 hours, pour, wait 3 or 4 hours. So total 6 pours in a perfect world. But let's just say I was not happy with the second cutout because it was too deep or definition wasn't good. So just as an example, that would mean 6 more pours. So that would be 18. And then say if on the Anubis I still wasn't happy with how it came out, I would do that, well, 2 times 2 is 4. So that would be 22 different pours on this drum. Just an example if I screwed up. But I put a lot of time into pouring this, and we'll show that later, the actual process. But a lot of time went into this drum. It's a good thing I don't charge by the hour or design these per hour. I do drums because I like doing drums, but it also means next time if somebody asks for this, I will charge for the hours because I enjoy inventing and testing and figuring out artsy projects. But once I start repeating and do a production type environment, my price goes up, honestly, which is kind of weird, but it's the way it is. Once I've figured it out, I don't see the thrill in doing another one again, so my process gets kind of weird. The more I do, the price gets higher, not cheaper. But hey, that's how it works when it's a hobby, not a business. I did do individual tool paths here. We can look at these. We've got the outline tool paths. I was working on this one at the end. So again, that's the blue outline. Then the 30-bit, I use a downtown Jenny, a down-cut Jenny 30-degree bit. And you can see where it gets the outside edge there. And then the other steps here. So I try to enable them 1 for the outline, 2 for the first cut, and 3 for the next cut. I'm sorry, 3 is the outline again, and 4 is the final cut inside the little spots there. Try to keep things straight in my mind. I number these so I don't get messed up, because it's easy to do. Sometimes this is the dominant color, and sometimes it's the background color. So again, lots of things to keep straight when you're doing this, and it's easy to get messed up. That's why I like a numbering system for these tool paths, because Lord knows in the past I have messed up simple things just because it doesn't seem natural. When I have one that's, say, black is the outside and another one white is the outside one, I get mixed up which is which. So lots of different techniques I use to keep things straight here. Then later I have the skim the whole bowl, which you'll see that one when I do the reveal tool path, drilling all the lugs, the butt plate, the vent, and not sure what that one was. Oh, that's the outside edge, and a test where I added something I wasn't happy, so I did another quick test there and the outline. So those two are kind of redundant, but you can see the tool, the holes for the lugs, and that would be the butt plate, the vent will be there. All different things. Outside cutout edge, it goes in a little bit for the snare bed. Done in VCarve Pro. When we were in VCarve Pro design software a second ago, I showed 3 different pockets for each design. The first one is an outline, which I've already done here. You can kind of see the outline edge there. I sealed that so it would not show through if the epoxy by chance bled through into the wood. This is the second one. This will be filled with epoxy in the end. Sometimes I fill with white, sometimes with black. I have to keep that kind of straight in my mind. There are 2 different bits used to cut these pockets. The first is a 30-degree down cut. That's a downtown Jenny. I love those bits. Hey, Cody. Second of all, I will use a clearing bit to cut out the inside of that pocket, and that'll be a 1/8 inch end mill. I mentioned before that the drum has 6 separate designs on it. This toolpath is doing the pocket for all 6 at once. I'm not doing one at a time. I've combined it all, so all 6 are done at once. And this will be the second half of that toolpath. This is the 1/8 inch end mill. Here I'm setting it to the 0 point, which the clamshells on the outside, the MDF there, those are exactly 13.875, which is the size I want the drum to be. So I'm using that as my 0 point for all my carving. The drum I mentioned before is oversized, so if I set that to 0 there, I would have bad results. It wouldn't be deep enough. So that's why I'm doing that. And as I mentioned, the 1/8 inch is cutting inside of that toolpath, clearing out or hogging out all that excess wood, that we got a nice sharp edge with the V-bit. I mentioned before that Ziricote is the most expensive wood I've ever built a drum out of. And each time I run a toolpath, I am so nervous. I'm double checking everything because I do not want to ruin this drum. It would break my heart if I had to throw this drum away. It already looks so good with that Ziricote. I'm so happy, and gosh, if I messed up by some stupid mistake, which I often do, it would just kill me. And here is a quick beauty shot of the drum after that first toolpath. I'll take it through a full rotation. You can see all those pockets I carved for the first pour that will happen soon. I've mentioned several times I'm going to build a dam around these shapes that will hold the epoxy in place so it won't run down the side of the drum when I pour the epoxy. I tested many different things: hot glue, painter's tape, silicone caulk, all sorts of different things. And after a bunch of research, it turns out that the expanding foam used for filling joints and a lot of household tools works very good for this. When doing my research, it mentioned polyester was a good thing to use for working with epoxy, and I remember in the back of my mind that this foam is made from polyester. So I went out and bought a can and did some tests, and I bought another can and did some more tests, and finally the third can worked out, and that's the can you're seeing right now. And I sped this way up. Hopefully you don't get dizzy watching this last few seconds here. The next day, after it had fully expanded and hardened all the way, I decided it was a little taller than I wanted, so I skimmed it down so it was only a 1/2 inch tall. And I'll speed this up again so we don't waste too much time just watching that spin round and round and round. And now that we have the pocket carved, it's sealed, and we've spray foamed around the edges to get our dam built, it's time to actually start doing the epoxy pour. I use a scale to pour out my epoxy, and in this case, this one will be a white pour for one of the backgrounds. I'm using Alumilite white dyes. I kind of like these. For certain things, you want that mica, that swirl effect, and certain times you don't. And for the background, when it's not the dominant color, I do not want that. So this is just pure white, it will be. One of the things I learned with Alumilite dyes, if I want a swirl in there, I can add a hint of other color in there, and it comes through really nice. You'll notice in the black, for the anubis especially, there's some gold streaks in that. That's how I got that effect. I put some mica powders in with this Alumilite dye. Really comes out nice. That's one of my secrets I'm giving up here. And now I'm pouring that white epoxy into, this would be the scarab actually. Notice how I'm trying to get this as level as possible. It's going to be very thick on the ends, and if it's not centered right, it gets too thick on one end and too thin on the other, obviously. One more adjustment to get it just right on that. I'll get the toothpick out and follow all the contours and the sharp edges inside there. That's where bubbles like to hide. So I'll always run the toothpick around the edges, sharp edges, just fighting those bubbles any way you can. You don't want bubbles. You can fix those later, but it's kind of a pain in the rear. So anything I can do now will save much time later. And the hot air gun, or some people use a blowtorch, both are good ways to get rid of those bubbles again. though I think spray foam might be flammable, so using a blowtorch here would be a bad idea. I mentioned previously how I'm going to skim it down between the pores. That's what this step right here is doing. I'm only going to show skimming one of those because doing all 6 would be honestly kind of boring. And now it is carving the pocket that goes inside the first pore, or the base color I called it. It'll be a white, or in this case actually an ivory with a swirl effect. This cut's very similar to the first one. It's a 30-degree downcut V-bit and an 1/8" end mill. For this pour, I'm using an ivory epoxy. It's normal epoxy with mica powders mixed in. Mica powders give a nice swirl effect. In this case, it looks like mother of pearl. Really nice effect. Through the drying process or curing process, I will come out and stir it with the toothpick multiple times to really get that swirl to come out nice. I'll point out that mother of pearl effect later when I'm showing pictures of the drum. And once again, I'm going to use that toothpick to try to pop all the bubbles that are caught in those little sharp edges. Of course, the inside cut here has many more sharp edges, so it takes a lot longer to try to root out all those bubbles. I just hate those bubbles. It drives you nuts trying to get them all, but I did a pretty good job on this drum. I had very few, and the little few I had were easy to repair, so I'm pretty happy with this one. And of course, once I'm done with the toothpick, I will use the heat gun again. After it's been poured, I come out every 15 minutes or so and try to get any more bubbles I can. I'll follow the edges again and use the heat gun again. And after a while, say, I don't know, I'm going to guess half an hour, but it changes depending on temperatures and so many different things. But at a certain point, it gets a little bit thicker. That's the time to really try to get that swirl effect. Spin it some, all sorts of effects, trying to get that nice design. And you can keep doing it over again as long as it's still not thickened up hard. And I'll go through this till I'm really happy with the design I think it'll come out with. It will hold that design inside after it's skimmed off. And now it's time for the big reveal. I have the video going at 4 times normal speed, so it's a little faster than normal. And I tore off all the yellow spray foam by hand just to get ready for this video. The scary thing is, you see the top layer, you have no idea what it looks like inside there. So it's a very scary thing to see if it actually came out. And once I see how this looks darn good, I was literally jumping for joy. I was jumping up and down. I was so happy. Again, such an expensive piece of wood, so much time put in this, but you don't know till that last second when you skim it off. Did it really turn out? I have to say, it turned out better than I expected. I am so happy at this point. And here's a final shot before I take it off the machine. At this point, I have drilled the lug holes, drilled the vent holes for the hardware, and I've scored the top and the bottom 0.4 inches in for the top and the bottom that I'll later clean up with the router table. The next step is to skim the inside of the drum. I normally do this in 1 or 2 passes, but this wood is so dense, hard, thick, whatever you want to say. I did many passes because I did not want to have a chance of it grabbing it and taking a gouge out. Again, I'm being very careful with this drum. So I did 4 or 5 passes. I don't remember exactly, but many passes to get the inside just right. You might be wondering why I'm showing a picture of the drum mounted on the CNC again. I'm showing this for an example. When I sealed that drum so the epoxy wouldn't run through, I used my normal finish, which is a urethane top coat, and it darkened the wood quite a bit, and I did not like that. So I knew I had to do some research to figure out how to finish the drum when I got to that point. I put in a little arrow here. You can see the difference between where it's been skimmed off and it's more the natural color, and where it hasn't been skimmed and it's the darker color of the finish. I did quite a bit of research to try to figure out what the best finish would be to not darken this wood too much darker. And I eventually ended up with shellac. And shellac is good and also has some weak points, but I'm going to put shellac down first, then put some top coat on top of that, which at that point will not darken the wood anymore. There's several things you could use to make the wood not darker. One of them is water-based finish, which is tempting, but Ziricote has a relatively high content of oil, and using a water-based finish on a high oil wood just scares me a little bit. I want this to hold up over time, so water and oil mixing together just didn't sound right. So that narrowed down to shellac and lacquer, and I just felt better using shellac. So that's what I ended up using. One of the things I really like about shellac is that when you put layers on top of layers, it melts together basically. We'll make one thick layer instead of like a normal polyurethane. If you put 10 layers down, you'll have 10 separate layers, whereas shellac, you'll have one thicker layer. And that's very appealing for getting a good finish and sanding out and buffing, just things like that. It makes a lot of sense. So that's one of the reasons I went with that. So when I say that shellac didn't darken the wood, that's not 100% correct. The dark areas, the veins, got darker, and the medium colors got relatively darker too, but it stayed consistent that you could see the veins between the lights and the darks. Came out very nice in the end. I tried using different finishes. I tried poly, I tried a hard wax, different things, and on those, the dark got darker, but the medium color browns got a lot darker too. You could not see the difference between those two color palettes. So again, very happy with using the shellac instead of these other finishes. The shellac I used, I thinned out with denatured alcohol, and I put down many thin layers. Every third or fourth layer I would buff out with a 3M buffing pad. Once I was happy with that, I wet sand up to 2000 grit and got a very good finish. And then I decided to burnish it on the buffing wheel. Those of you who've worked with shellac in the past just screamed. There's an issue with burnishing shellac. It has a very low melting point, and once you start burnishing, it creates heat and you get kind of a gooey mess, which kind of will piss you off. Trust me, I know this, learning the hard way. My plan was to shoot video of that after I'd got my technique down for burnishing, which of course never happened, so there is no video evidence of this happening. The good news about shellac is you can repair it quite easily. You sand off all the issues and you replay more layers of shellac and it melts together, so it looks very good again. So I'm happy, though I wasted several hours fixing my stupid mistake. So after going through the same process of applying layers, buffing with 3M pads, then wet sanding, instead of burnishing, this time I added several layers of Armor Seal. It's a urethane finish by General Finishes. It's my go-to finish. I've been very happy with that. And from there, I wet sand again, buffed it by hand, and got a great finish. Here are some still shots of the 3 different pieces of artwork I had for this drum. Remember when I was mixing up the epoxy, I talked about the black aluminite dye, mixing in some mica powders? That's the effect you get with that. I really like that effect. And then of course on the Ankh, I used mica powder's pearl essence to get the nice pearl, mother of pearl effect. And then the scarab, I went more traditional black and white because there's not a dominant color in there, and I was afraid it would fight if I tried to have swirls in that one. And then we have one last beauty shot of the drum going around on my turntable here. Words don't really express how beautiful this drum really is. The artwork came out great, and the grain and definition of Ziricote is just fabulous. I've always loved this type of wood. Building this drum has been a real experience, many trials, tests, tribulations, mistakes, but in the end, it really came out nice. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and giving this video a like. Have a great day.